In this video, I'm going to take a look at one example trying to prove whether or not a parallelogram is a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square. Or maybe it's all three of them. So what I'm going to do to start is I'm going to just plot my parallelogram. Go through, I'm going to get my negative 2, 1, negative 2, negative 1, excuse me. There's A. B is at 3, 2, about there. C is going to be at negative 1, 3, and D is going to be at 2, negative 2. I have parallelogram ACBD. And remember, this is going to be important. It tells us in the problem it's a parallelogram. Therefore, we already know all those properties are going to hold true to this. For example, the opposite sides are congruent, the opposite angles are congruent, the diagonals are bisecting each other, and all those other properties that we've learned about parallelograms. So my thing to do is I have to figure out, is this thing maybe a rhombus, maybe it's a rectangle, or maybe it's both of those things and we get to call it a square. So I have to go through and I'm going to check it. I'm going to go here and I'm going to check to see if it's a rectangle first by looking at the slope of segment AC and the slope of segment BC. If those slopes are opposite reciprocals, I know I have a right angle C, and being I already know it's a parallelogram, if one angle is right, I know they're all right. So in this case, I only have to check the slopes of two sides. So I'm going to start off with the slope of segment AC. I'm going to take my x values, my y values, I'm going to subtract those, so 3 minus negative 1, and then divided by my x values that I'm going to subtract, and I end up with 4 over 1, so a slope of 4. Now I'll go to my slope of segment BC, and if I'm going to have a right angle at angle C, the slope of this segment is going to have to be negative 1/4. Well, I'm going to have to check it out. Take 3 minus 2, those are my y values, and then take negative 1 minus 3. And I end up with 1 over negative 4. So yes, these two sides are perpendicular. This one has a slope of negative 1/4. This one had a slope of 4. Therefore, I have a right angle right there. And remember, if one angle is right in a parallelogram, then they're all right. So right now, I know that I have a rectangle. This much information right here says rectangle. Well, now I need to check to see if it's a rhombus. So I have a couple options here. I could go through and I could check how long segment AC and how long segment BC is. If they were both equal in length, I know it's a rhombus because I already know it's a parallelogram. The two sides are already, I have two sets of congruent sides. If I check the two that are next to each other, if those are congruent, well then I'm going to know all four of them are congruent. I don't like that method because distance formula to me takes a long time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the diagonals. I'm going to look at segment CD and I'm going to look at segment AB. I had one of my properties or theorems said that if the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular, did I say that right? If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then it's a rhombus. So I'm going to check to see if they're perpendicular by looking at their slopes. Alright, so I want to check the slope of segment CD. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take all this stuff and move it down. Alright, I have that moved. Now I can look at my slopes of my two diagonals. I'll start with the slope of segment AB. Now I'm going to subtract my y values again, subtract my x values, and I get a slope of 3/5. Now I'm going to check the slope on segment CD. Go through the same process. There's my y values, here are my x values. So I end up with negative 5 over 3. Well, they're opposite reciprocals, therefore I know I have a right angle here. And again, if the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then it is a rhombus. So this information here says rhombus. But then come back here and go, well, if it's a rhombus, I know the four sides are congruent. If it's a rectangle, I know the four angles are congruent. So if it's a rhombus and a rectangle, then it also has to be a square. Therefore, this parallelogram is a rhombus, a rectangle, and a square. And I did that all just by looking at slope. Now, there are other methods. I just feel that this one's the fastest one, but not necessarily the best one. You do whatever method that you feel it works best for you. Now, that's going to conclude my one example on determining what kind of parallelogram we have.